Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching by Rabbi-Cantor Hilary Chorny.
I am excited to do a little bit of learning, as I mentioned, about this point in the Balak story that has to do with a curse that makes it into our liturgy. Part of what makes it exciting is that it's a piece of liturgy from the Torah, straight from our Torah text. And as Larry, who's here with us on Zoom, and I were discussing in our class, and Marlise might be around somewhere too, she's also in that class regularly, we discuss how it's very rare for a substantial piece of text, not just from Tanakh, not just from Hebrew Bible, but from the Torah text itself, to make its way into our liturgy and to stay in liturgy. The example that I gave earlier this week in class is the text of Aseret HaDibrot, which made it into our liturgy for a substantial amount of time. It stayed in there for centuries until it was removed because of concerns that there were Christological understandings of those 10 commandments as having more import than the other 603, and that, along with some other concerns, eventually had those 10 commandments removed. So very few direct quotes from the first 5 books, from the 5 books of Moses, make it into our daily liturgy, certainly. Can anyone think of examples of direct quotes that make it into our daily liturgy?
Shema?
There you go, yes. Shema makes it in, and that's probably the fullest, or nearly the lengthiest, 3-paragraph plus the line of Shema itself quote. What else makes it in?
V'shamru, Vayachulu. Those
are great, and those are weekly, right? Because those make it in on at least Friday nights, and in the case of V'shamru, both Friday nights and Saturdays. What makes it in daily?
Shirat Hayam.
Great, Shirat Hayam. We've studied that.
Tradition, the Akedah.
Great. Exactly. In some traditions, the Akedah will make it in. Fantastic.
Some of the morning before the service starts.
Good. I like your broad answer because it's all inclusive. Good. Probably there's something in there. Good. Why don't you think about the very end of the Amidah, only said when we have a minyan present and we're doing a full repetition?
Sure. The priestly blessing.
Is
the priestly blessings. Good.
The thing about
very good.
Where the rain falls next to the neighbor?
The rain falls next to the neighbor. Can you say a little more?
I just remember it as it's people use it in theodicy about why bad things happen to good people because maybe your neighbor's getting something. But I would have to look fast in Isidore to think what it is.
If you find it, great, let me know. So these are all wonderful examples of things that actually do make it into daily liturgy. They're about 4 or 5. If you find another one, I'd love to know because I like to keep a list. And these are the very few that make it into daily liturgy. Another one of them is Tovu, which comes straight from this week's Parsha. It's often offered as something that's said in 2 instances upon walking into a synagogue. I want to give you the example that most people know and the example that most people don't know. Okay? The example that most people know is that it is often said as the first verse, not upon waking, that's Moda ani lefanecha, grateful am I before you, God, but the first verse said upon walking into a synagogue. This is the first text that's found on your source sheet. It's Numbers chapter 24, verse 5, and it's Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, right? Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov. You may know that song from the 19th century, I think, or maybe early 20th. I should have looked up the composer beforehand. It's a fully composed piece. This line is said upon walking into the synagogue because of its obvious connection with praise of how how lovely is your ohel, your mishkan, right? Because walking into a synagogue. It is also a beautiful verse to say when, okay, let me just offer you a circumstance. Instead of just telling it to you vaguely, I'm going to tell you a story. There's a beautiful synagogue on the grounds of the Jewish Theological Seminary where I attended cantorial and rabbinical school. It's called the Women's League Seminary Synagogue. Plug for everyone to support Torah Fund and Women's League. It supports our seminary students all across the world. And they supported the building of this gorgeous and also newly renovated sanctuary. And it's right next to Kripke Tower. Kripke, long story, it was the old library. There was a fire. It's the big tower you see at 3080 Broadway if you've ever been to the building in New York City. And you can enter, and most people do, from the side near the elevators over by the Kripke Tower. But you also might have classes in the other building on the other side of the sanctuary. And for a whole host of bizarre reasons, because of the way that the building is constructed and it's a bit inaccessible, I don't know how they deal with Americans with Disabilities Act. Sometimes the easiest way to get to those classes is to go right through the sanctuary. But there's an explicit prohibition, and you bet seminary students know about it, that you're not supposed to cut through a sanctuary without at least studying a little bit of Torah. So I have, with my own ears, heard many a seminary student and even a professor walk quickly through that synagogue and gone, Ma Tovu Yaakov Mishkanotecha Yisrael, because it's a great 5-liner and saying a verse, just to be cognizant of the fact that they're cutting through, which they shouldn't do anyway, but if you're going to do it, say a verse of Torah to be cognizant of the fact that you're cutting through a sanctuary to get to a staircase so you can, take the stairs up or down to get to this bizarrely constructed side of the building. So you can say this line to do it. And that's my visual reference to this verse. Okay. So that's to kind of situate us in the way that we use this liturgy. I want us to flash backwards for this text from the Dat Zakanim, which I gave you a little bit of background on. It's Middle Age France, Germany, Italy, England. It's this big school of commentators from crossing a couple of centuries that was compiled later. And it's the Bali Tosafot. It's a Tosafistic school that gives us commentary on this Ma Tovu. And I want us to flash backwards because before we even think about its problematic place in liturgy, I'd like us to think about how this text troubled our rabbinic commentators and might trouble us as our own rabbinic commentators. You can be a rabbinic commentator. I appoint you such, thusly. I want you to think about how this troubled their minds and how it might trouble ours in terms of this story. Who was Balaam? He's this guy, the son of Peor, right? That's his father his father is, who is his father? Let's see. He is Balaam, and he is son of Beor. He lives in Petor. Go Petora and go find this guy, Balaam ben Beor. Go find him. He is a sorcerer. Who tells his folks to go find him? The king named Balak, who is the head of the Moabites. Now, the Moabites saw what happened to the Amorites. We know these names because we recount them actually liturgically on a daily basis. We talk about what happened to some of those folks before us in the wilderness. And the Moabites thought, well, that's not great what happened to the Amorites. Let's see if we can earn some protexia. Let's see if we can get in on the good side. And they believed that sorcery was one way to do this, to hire someone to curse the Israelites. So they send out for Balak. In the story, God tries to stop tries to stop Balaam the sorcerer from doing the cursing a lot of different ways. First of all, does Balaam say yes right away? No. He hesitates. He says, let me sleep on it. You guys sleep over there. I'm going to sleep on it. I'm going to talk to God. Talks to God. God says, absolutely not. Do not do this. So he says, no. The messengers go back to Balak, and Balak says, go back with more money. So he goes back with more money. Again, he says, I'll sleep on this. God says, go ahead, but absolutely under no circumstances do you curse them. And God is pretty mad that Balaam doesn't take the hint, right? Balaam, goes, for the money and, takes God's yes, even though he shouldn't have taken God's yes. So he sends the whole donkey angel path situation, right? An angel to block the path on the way. God tries to stop this whole thing from happening. But ultimately, the only way that God somehow seems to be able to exert divine force into the story happens in the moment in which Balaam opens his mouth to curse and says a blessing. And the disagreement among the rabbis about what happens in that moment is the following. You have to understand this to understand the Da'at Zekenim's commentary. They are wondering the following. Did Balaam bless the Israelites on purpose, or did he not? Did Balaam ultimately, because you saw this character resisting, right? Resisting and resisting, doing this cursing. Did Balaam write this blessing? Was he the composer of Ma Tovu Ohalecha Yaakov? Or did God write it and intervene and put it on Balaam's lips? Let's see what the Da'at Zekenim have to say about it. Will someone read it for us in English? From in the Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin, from there. Someone have that?
What are you asking us to read?
From here, where it starts, how goodly are your tents, Yaakov?
Yeah, you can start from there. Yeah.
In the Talmud Tractate Sanhedrin, Folio 105, treatment of this verse, Rabbi Yochanan is quoted as saying that the wording, i.e. the metaphors of Balaam's blessing, reveal that these blessings had been involuntary. He had intended to point to the paucity of synagogues and houses of Torah study, but what came out of his mouth were words of admiration for same. He referred to these houses of studies now as if they were equivalent to tabernacles devoted to God as his residence. Mishkanotecha Yisrael. Instead of saying that its dynasties would be short-lived, he said that they would flow like rivers. Instead of saying that they would not enjoy orchard and vineyards, he said, Kiganos, ale?
Yeah, right, Kiganot al Nahar, like gardens situate near.
Right. Growing up conservative, I need vowels.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Okay. Let's see. Like gardens situate near a river for easy irrigation. Rabbi Yochanan there continues in this vein, an alternate interpretation by Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana. All of Balaam's blessings eventually turned into curses when the Jewish people did not live up to the idealistic vision of them he had painted, except the blessings concerning the synagogues and houses of Torah study.
Okay, so thank you for reading that for us. That whole last part about his blessings turning back into curses could be its own interesting shiur, but we're not going to focus on that. I want to know from you why you think the rabbis would have felt more comfortable in this case of this Tosafistic school in the Da'at Zekenim, and they're not the only ones. Why are they more comfortable with the idea that God was the composer of these words and put them in Balaam's mouth than Balaam being the one who actually changed their mind? Let's see if there's someone else who wants to speak up on this when we haven't heard from yet.
I would assume that the rabbis didn't want to make it too easy, and they wanted to the Bilam actually that Bilam. You were saying that Bilam was the one that changed his mind, and I would say the rabbis would say no, it's not. That's too easy for Bilam. It's God has to be the one who has to make the change.
Okay, I like that idea. So it'd be too easy to let Bilam just run with it and have that win. That we want it to be that God intervened and that there was another divine moment there.
Right.
Very interesting. Okay, Joanna?
I'm wondering if the rabbis are asking this question already at the point when this verse was being used liturgically, because the question then becomes, we've got like this non-Jewish prophet's words that have made it into our liturgy, and the words of Moses and the words of, Abraham, the other, words out of the mouths of our own people do not seem to be in our liturgy. So, I think some of the discomfort there is some of the same questions that are raised around the prophet Yonah, like, going to prophesy to a non-Jewish group of people. Like, why are we so busy and concerned about that?
Okay, just because we're short on time and because that was such a great transition to the next point, Tybal, I'm not ignoring your hand. I just want to use that as the transition to the next thing and hold on to that thought, okay? What a wonderful question to plant, Joanna, which is, well, gosh, what if it was already in the Siddur? Because if it were already in the Siddur, it would feel really uncomfortable to know that the words of a foreign sorcerer for hire were the ones that we were using to open our mouths to praise each day in a sanctuary. And here, look at the next source, if you will, please, or listen if you're just tuning in, or if this is later on the podcast and you're not looking at the source sheet. So, Seder Rav Amram Gaon, which is one of the oldest intact Sidurim that we have. It's from the 9th century. Remember that these Tosafistic schools we were looking at were from the 11th through 13th centuries. Already in Sura, Babylonia, we have this 9th century full Seder Rav Amram Gaon, one of the two of the earliest full Sidurim that we have. We have Hanichnas lebeit haKnesset omer ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael v'ani berov chastecha avo veitecha eshachave elechal kodecha b'yiratecha. And then there's an instruction also, and when you leave, so that's what the one who comes into the synagogue should say this, and the one who goes out should say, and then insert a line. So there was a secondary line that you all may have seen in the Siddur before from Psalms, from the 5th Psalm, and then when you leave, you should say this line from Psalm 5. So it was in the Siddur. So, Joanna, that definitely stands up to your point, this point of discomfort. And just this week, I was responding into a thread, again, to bring up our friend Larry, who is here with us, not to ignore you, Diane, but Larry and I have it's good to see you too. Larry and I have had a back and forth on this a bit this week with the rest of the clergy, talking about questions of what we do with challenging authorship around composers in the Siddur. This, may be one of the oldest questions around this, I think, right? It may be one of the oldest arguments around it. I want to show you the oldest version of the argument around this. You ready? Go down to the next source here, to Shut HaMaharshal. These are the She'elot Utshuvot, these letters back and forth from Rav Shlomo Luria from the 16th century. What does he say? K'sha'ani ba leveit haKnesset ma'achil ani b'psuk va'ani berov chastecha. When I come to shul, I start with that verse from the Psalms and skip that first verse, Ma Tovu, because Bilam said it first. And he said it as a curse, as we find in Sanhedrin 105b. And this is not its proper place. So it's later. It's 16th century already, and Shlomo Luria is like, oh boy, no, right? It's such a beautiful, I think, analog to some of the conversations that we are witness to in contemporary times about generations that precede ours who were not troubled by some of the origins of the literature or liturgy or the music that we might have taken to heart and used to uplift ourselves. And then a later generation comes along and says, I am not comfortable with this. I would be very curious for any thoughts that any of you have, either on this appearance in the Siddur Rav Amram or of the Maharshal's opinion. What do you think of this? And of the Maharshal's refusal to say Ma Tovu?
I think one of the things we're confronted with also is changing values, right? So what might have been comfortable for an earlier generation is not comfortable for ours. You know, there's a whole thing going on now around, Picasso and how he treated women. And, I don't know if this was Larry's question and if this opens a can of worms, but singing the music of Karlbach, sometimes presents some issues for certain people. And yet it is music that so moves our souls. I mean, speaking collectively, but just knowing the influence of his music. And I have heard so many musicians also say how influenced they were by his music, right? So there's the fruit of that also. And, so there are tough questions to wrestle with and, to apply our values to that were not necessarily the values of previous generations. And it also feeds into things like gender sensitive language and God sensitive language. And there's a million more things that could be said, and I've said enough. And
it's beautiful, and I'll just clarify that it was an asked and answered Shaila and Shuva of my dear teacher, and I think a dear teacher of Larry's as well, Rabbi David Golinkin, having to do with the use of contemporary music as applied to contemporary to any given generation as applied to liturgy, Jewish liturgy. Tybal, I would love to hear from you, and then from the Hermans.
This is what I wanted to say before, is just toss out there, because the phrase where the words came from, it's not just spirit, but it's Spirit of God, and it's the Elohim version of God. And the first place the Spirit of God is found in the Torah is the second verse. I mean, in terms of creation, and then it's all through Bereshit. So at a certain level, if the Spirit of God was creating the world in that exact phrase with that God name, and then the Spirit of God was moving whoever this was, is it chutzpahdik to ignore the Spirit of God?
I love that, because for me, I'll just out myself as somebody who does say Ma Tovu. As controversial as that may be, I don't think it's controversial. I think about this wrestling factor and the wondering about the divine inspiration in that moment, and the very wrestling, no pun intended, or maybe so, with the Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov and the Yisrael connection there. I like the wrestling with that. And is Elohim placed to the side or not? I like the wrestling with it and with the maintaining of it. Right, Hermans.
So there's always a tension between tradition and then new ways of looking at things. And our tradition tells us that tradition is very powerful and becomes, in some sense, halakha. So to go against the tradition of saying the words Ma Tovu was somewhat, I think you said, chutzpahdik, as it was accepted practice at that point.
Yeah, I think it's deeply chutzpahdik, and I think, Diane, one of the most powerful things for us to study here together and to empower one another with as prayers, as people who are engaged in our own liturgical practices, is to get past this idea that the Siddur has only gotten thicker. We have this sense that we've only added to the Siddur over time, and it's just not true. Once upon a time, the 10 Commandments did appear in the Siddur. Once upon a time, the Akedah was in all Siddurim, and now you won't find it. And somebody who didn't grow up in a movement that includes it won't know that that's a part of normative daily liturgy, right? And maybe somebody who grew up in the communities that the Maharshal has influence over. I've never asked in Prague, what happened over there, but maybe there it doesn't appear. It'd be an interesting research. So I think that's what makes it interesting, is to know that you might think that it only got thicker, but apparently people have had that chutzpah over time to go against that tradition and to say maybe we should take it out.
Just before Larry's piece, I want to add one more thing, which is that Rabbi Golinkin also has paskined about the inclusion of the imahot in the service. And that goes back to the liturgy using Torah words or concepts. It's a really interesting question.
And I actually vastly prefer his approach to it than the one that was published in Siddur Sim Shalom, which is why, if it weren't for a lot of other things, I would daven from Va'ani Tefilati just to use his construct of the imahot. But that's
his construct is not in Va'ani Tefilati.
We'll tell you later. It's caused a huge rift in his and our home shul.
Oh, I have many questions about that, but to be continued on that, because I think Larry has other things to say. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to take a lot of time. I just want to mention that I have a lot to say about all of this, and at another time with you in class and with Johanna any time. Especially, as I said, since I'm trying to incorporate some jazz themes into a Kabbalat Shabbat sometime. But this morning at Library Minyan, Henry Morgan was leading the Torah service, and he substituted some passages that are in the back of the Lev Shalem instead of the prayer for the country in honor of Juneteenth Day today. And it included things that were historical. I think readings for the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and something else. So there's an example of bringing something in. It's not really tefillah, but into the service that I thought actually contributed greatly. I thought it was a wonderful thing that he did.
Wow, that is stunning. That's so beautiful, and thank you for sharing that, Larry. I don't want to cut anybody off or cut off our time here, but please hold on to other thoughts, because I want to share this very last piece of Torah to wrap us up. Write me later with your other thoughts. Let's extend this conversation, because I'm enjoying it and I have more I'd like to hear from you. Let me share this last Rashi with you, please. I'm going to tell it more as a story than reading the source. I want to share it with you, not because it has anything to do with this text, but because it's one of my favorite pieces of Midrash. It has to do with the bringing of offerings to the Mishkan in the Midbar. And apparently, so it goes, in this ancient Midrash, some women brought to Moshe mirrors of copper. And these mirrors of copper seemed to Moshe to be offerings that represented Yetzer Hara, that represented not only like an evil inclination, but vanity, right? Why would you bring mirrors that were used for personal use to the tabernacle? And God not only said to Moshe that he should accept these offerings, but that they were more desirous to God than any other offering. And why? Because when the slaves were laboring in Egypt, the women would bring their partners at the end of a long and terribly awful day in front of the mirror, and they would say things. They would turn to their partners. They would dress themselves up and turn to their partners, and they would say things to them to entice them to come together with them and to continue hosts of generations coming from them at that time, answering the question, how is it possible that Jewish babies continued to even be made under the conditions of slavery? I love this story because it's colorful. And I love this midrash because it tells us the story of how something that seems to come from a source that is so uncomfortable is actually intended and turned around in its story to be used for something that is at its most holy. I think it's really important for us to think about how things can be repurposed and reframed. The same stories can be told, by the way, if you listen back to the podcast to Rabbi Klickfeld's commentary on the ways that the incense was used and refashioned as used in the temple, because it was a reminder of the ways, and also the copper fire pans as they were used under the worst conditions, those very things hanging amongst the Israelites during their holy service were reminders of what not to do and how to be, right? So we can repurpose things, and it's in our repurposing of them and in our way of looking at them that allows us to understand what meaning we insert in them and what meaning we apply to them. That's how liturgy works. That's how music works as applied to liturgy, and so on and so forth. So I look forward to continuing this conversation with everyone.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.